Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a time when arguments didn't echo down internet forums, but instead settled quietly, stubbornly in the grooves of carved wood. You are standing in a low-ceilinged workshop in Norwich, England, the year somewhere between 1255, and when bread still counted as cutlery. A single oil lamp swings gently overhead. Its weak glow flickers across benches cluttered with chisels, unfinished pawns, and curls of shorn oak. Outside, the wind is practicing its melancholy through the cathedral arches, but in here, there's only the whisper of sandpaper against ivory. You, lucky soul, have been hired as a carver's apprentice. Congratulations! You'll earn about 2 buttons and a bowl of turnips a week. Your main job, not to sneeze on the tusks, especially not the prized one. The glistening slab of walrus ivory imported at immense expense, smuggled in after a monk accidentally forgot to declare it at port. You probably won't survive this job without at least 3 splinters and a mild vendetta against the master carver. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing next to a heavy bench layered with generations of wood chips and the occasional fossilized crumb of rye bread. The carvers around you don't speak much. That's not because they're shy. It's because talking has a funny way of making the queen's crown come out lopsided. So instead, they argue with the grain. A little too much pressure on a rook's turret means irritation. An extra flourish on the bishop's mitre, pure spite. These chessboard artisans may not raise their voices, but their tools do plenty of shouting. Your master, Giles, though everyone calls him Quiet Giles as a joke, taps a square of sycamore and sighs. He doesn't say it, but you know what that sigh means. The grain is fighting back today. Sycamore is a fickle wood, smooth in the morning, obstinate by tea. Some blame the humidity. Others say the wood has moods. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen actually believed timber could hold grudges, or if they were just sleep-deprived and full of mead. You trace your fingers over a half-finished board, 32 light squares, 32 dark. That pattern is so familiar now that you almost forget someone once had to invent it. Before the 12th century, boards were often uncolored. The alternating squares only became popular when Persian and Arabic chess styles filtered into Europe, and someone, probably a bishop with a flair for design, decided contrast would reduce squinting, a practical innovation born from aesthetic arguments. But today's board has a problem. The corner squares are misaligned by a hair. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking, but in this shop, that's enough to cause a cold war? Giles suspects it's the work of Thomas, a carver 2 benches down who always insists on starting with the sole square, the central light square, and working outwards. Giles, like any sensible man, begins with the lower left corner and moves clockwise. Their methods are incompatible, like putting jam on both sides of toast. As you reach for your chisel, someone sneezes. You all freeze. Dust floats in the beam of light like scandal. Then, from the far bench, someone mutters, "Bless you." It's not sarcastic, but it's also not kind. A silent rebuke. The unspoken rule is no sneezing near the ivory. That particular tusk is meant for a commission from a baron's wife, who reportedly requested a chess queen who looks like she knows things, which sounds simple until you realize you have to carve smugness into bone without making her look like she's holding in a burp. One carver attempted this last week and ended up with a queen that looked suspiciously like a local baker's wife. She wasn't amused. She never is. Outside, a bell tolls somewhere deep in the town, and the scent of damp stone drifts in through the cracks. You look up to see a raven watching you through the high, soot-smeared window. Its beady eyes say, "Don't mess up the bishops again." You won't. Probably. The workshop feels timeless. If you squint, you can pretend you're just part of the wood grain yourself, caught between the rings of history and tradition. But here's the funny part. No one in this room actually plays chess. Most of the carvers can't read either. They know how the shape of a knight's jaw better than they know their lord's tax demands. They carve because carving is holy, because shaping order out of chaos. Even if it's just 32 squares and 16 pieces per side, is a form of soft rebellion against the rest of their messy, plague-prone lives. And yet, rivalry simmers, not with swords or shouting, but with detail. One apprentice starts to carve a bishop's crozier with a slightly more ambitious curl than usual. Across the room, an older carver sniffs and begins his next piece with a double curl. This will escalate. Mark your words. By Sunday, someone will have added a tiny, smug owl to their bishop's staff just to prove a point. You run your thumb along a finished rook. It's heavy, angular, precise, but when you turn it over, you see it in almost invisible etching. Still better than Thomas. You stifle a laugh. The rook doesn't care. It knows it's winning. The candle gutters. The sawdust settles. You breathe in wood, wax, and faint rivalry. The argument, if you can call it that, begins like many good medieval disputes with a bishop. You're sanding a knight's flank when you overhear it. Not words, of course, just the sudden, exaggerated scrape of a chisel on wood, followed by a slow, deliberate pause. Across the room, Thomas is holding up his latest bishop figure like it's just delivered the Sermon on the Mount. It's elegant, sharp-nosed, and clearly wearing the rounded, mitre-like headpiece of the Catholic clergy. Giles sees it. You can feel him seeing it, without even turning around. This again. See, there's no consensus on what a bishop chess piece is supposed to look like. Even now, historians still argue whether the original bishop design was meant to represent religious figures at all, or if it stemmed from earlier Islamic and Indian pieces that depicted elephants, advisors, or scribes. But in this workshop, there are only two camps, Team Clergy and Team Court Official, and they do not like each other. You peek at Giles, his jaw tightens, ever so slightly. Giles is a courtman. He prefers his bishops to look like royal advisors, complete with elaborate robes and a subtly flattened hat that definitely says, "I'm paid to whisper in the king's ear, not forgive your sins." Thomas, meanwhile, has gone full ecclesiastical. That bulbous mitre, it's practically smirking. You're stuck in the middle, quite literally. Your bench is between theirs, a diplomatic zone of awkward tension and splintered compromises. You once tried carving a neutral bishop, a little bit court, a little bit church. Giles patted your back and muttered, "Cowardice is smooth, I suppose." Thomas said nothing but left a loaf of dry bread on your bench the next day, which might have been kindness or commentary. Outside, the bells of St. Peter Mancroft ring out the hour. Inside, a new game is beginning not on a board, but in the invisible tug-of-war over iconography. You watch as Giles begins his own bishop. He carves slower than Thomas, but his blade speaks louder. Straight lines, firm jaw, a subtle tilt of the head. You swear this bishop is judging the other bishop. You sigh. This has been going on for years. At one point, the guild even considered formalizing bishop designs some kind of official guild blueprint. But that meeting devolved into someone throwing a handful of sand into someone else's mead. No one remembers whose mead. Everyone remembers the aftermath. A solid week of grim-faced carving and one mysteriously missing bishop that was later found in the privy. As the day drags on, you notice something stranger still. The patrons care deeply about the bishop debate. Nobles will walk into the workshop, inspect a board for purchase, and frown at the bishop before asking, "Is this papist?" As if the wood will confess its allegiance. One merchant even demanded a set with no bishops at all, insisting on a neutral placeholder shaped like a barrel. No one liked that version. The piece tipped over constantly and looked like a small drunk knight. That set was sold to a brewer in Essex, who never returned for a second commission. The rivalry might sound silly now, but this is the 13th century. Politics and religion are not separate topics. Every shape, every robe, every tilt of the head is an accusation or a defense. When you carve, you're not just shaping wood, you're placing bets on theology. It's just that everyone's too tired and polite to say so out loud. In the corner, old Agnes, the workshop's finishing specialist, begins painting the newest set. Her hands are so steady it's unnerving. She always paints the bishops last, like she's waiting to see which side wins before committing her brush. She claims it's just practical. Everyone else knows it's strategic. She catches your eye and winks. Then she leans in and paints Thomas's bishop's lips with just a little too much crimson. Not enough to be scandalous, just enough to be a conversation starter. Meanwhile, the apprentices are starting a low-stakes betting pool. Who'll make the better bishop this week? Giles, the ever-dignified secularist, or Thomas, the flamboyant monk whisperer? You decline to place a bet. You're not ready to choose a side. Besides, you still owe 3 buttons from last week's game, when you wagered on a rook carving contest that ended in a draw and a dented workbench. You look back at the 2 rival bishops side by side on the shelf. The contrast is subtle but unmistakable. Giles's figure stands upright, brows furrowed, robe lines sharp and efficient. Thomas's bishop leans forward ever so slightly, as if offering penance or maybe demanding it. Each figure, carved in silence, is a manifesto. You imagine these 2 pieces playing a match, not the full game, just locked in an eternal diagonal stare-down. No pawns between them, no queens, no kings, just the bishops. Neither one blinking. A breeze rustles through the high window again. You think about how many arguments in this room have ended not with resolution, but with layers of sawdust and another board on the shelf. Nothing gets solved. Everything gets carved. And maybe that's enough. The bell tolls again. The day slips into dusk. Thomas and Giles don't speak, of course, but as Giles stands to sharpen his blade and Thomas adjusts the crozier on his bishop, they glance at each other for a single, flickering moment, just long enough to restart the argument tomorrow. Today, the walrus tooth arrives. Not a whole walrus. Thankfully, just one gleaming, slightly curved tusk, bundled in straw and tied with a wax-sealed cord. You're the one who gets to open it. The straw smells faintly of salt and mold, as if the North Sea itself lent its breath to the packaging. You part the bundle and there it is. Creamy, ridged, slightly yellowed near the base, but cool and flawless to the touch. The entire workshop gathers around, pretending not to care, but caring very much. You hold the tusk like it's a newborn. And in a way, it is. This single piece of ivory cost more than most marriages, and at least 1 cow. It was smuggled from a Norwegian ship by a merchant with no documented trade license and a knack for saying whoops at just the right time. Whether it was stolen, bartered, or miraculously acquired, no one asks, no one wants to know. You just hear the whispers. That's her tusk. Her, of course, is the patron, Lady Edith of Framlingham. She's young, newly married, and already bored out of her skull with embroidery. She's commissioned a custom chess set her first, and she's requested something exceptional, which everyone understands as more expensive than my cousin's. The queen, she says, must be carved from the ivory. And so, the arguments begin. Who gets to carve it? Giles thinks it should be him. He's senior, precise, and has the steadiest hand this side of the river. Thomas, of course, claims divine right. He once carved a reliquary in the shape of St. Agatha's eyebrow. Agnes simply raises one thin brow and mutters, "I've carved lips more expressive than both your resumes." You wisely do not volunteer. The master decides. They'll each submit a design sketch for the queen, and Lady Edith will choose. You all know how this goes. The sketches will be wildly different, full of subtle jabs and symbolic sabotage. Giles's queen sketch arrives first. She's tall, austere, her crown like interlocking cathedral arches, her eyes narrowed in quiet judgment. She looks like someone who tells you to speak up at court, but then raises an eyebrow halfway through your sentence. Thomas's version is softer, almost maternal. The eyes are wide, the hands slightly open. And this is controversial. She has a book in her lap. A book. Giles says nothing. But later you find his own sketch amended with an added scroll tucked under the queen's arm, as if muttering, "I can read too." You know, Agnes paints a mock-up of each design onto 2 scrap pieces of bone. No one says it, but her test paint leans suspiciously in favor of Thomas's softer palette. Warm reds and golds, a touch of lavender. Giles's queen ends up in solemn black, which looks noble but slightly like she's preparing for a very organized funeral. Meanwhile, you get stuck with logistics measuring the ivory, sketching where the grain shifts, deciding how to extract one usable chunk without cracks or voids. It's a delicate process. One wrong slice, and the queen ends up with a hairline fracture across her face. You've seen it before. a beautiful figure undone by one invisible fault. Like a noble woman with a toothache, historians still argue whether this very ivory, this exact commission, is the origin of a well-known design tradition, the smirking queen. Several surviving chess queens from East Anglia around this period show a faint, knowing smile. Was it style? Coincidence? Or did Lady Edith demand her piece look like she knew everyone's secrets? No one agrees. The night before the carving begins, the ivory disappears. Panic is immediate but subdued. This is a respectable workshop. After all, no one screams. They just start moving faster than usual, muttering more under their breath. Agnes checks every cabinet. Giles lifts each bishop like it might be hiding something. Even Thomas has the decency to look worried. It's you who finds it. Not hidden, not stolen, just sitting quietly, innocently on Giles's bench, a fresh cloth folded around it, a note tucked underneath, written in awkward, slightly smeared ink, for the queen, not to be shared. There's no signature, but you recognize the handwriting. It's from the patron herself. Turns out, Lady Edith made her decision quietly during her last visit, when no one was looking. She had wandered the shop, hands behind her back, eyes scanning the shelves. At some point, she saw your apprentice sketch the rough, unsure queen figure. You'd been doodling in the margins while thinking about lunch. You hadn't even meant for anyone to see it. The figure had a tilted crown, a lopsided smirk, and the barest hint of a raised eyebrow. She chose your design. The workshop doesn't know what to do with that. Giles stares at the note like it personally betrayed him. Thomas, weirdly, looks relieved. Agnes cackles once, then turns it into a cough. You're told to carve it. No fanfare, no speech, just a nod and a very sharp knife handed to you with suspicious ceremony. The ivory is cool in your hands. It resists at first, but slowly, it yields. You shape the face, the smile, the tilt of the crown. You carve not perfection but personality. This queen looks like she's waiting for someone to speak first, and already knows they're going to say something stupid. By dusk, her eyes are done. She doesn't blink. By the time you finish carving Lady Edith's ivory queen, the rest of the workshop has grudgingly returned to their routines, or at least, they pretend to, but you can feel it. The quiet heat of envy swirling in the wood dust, sticking to aprons and eyebrows. Even the rook you'd half finished 2 weeks ago now seems to be side-eyeing you from the shelf like, so you're special now. Your reward? A new assignment. Board borders. Nobody wants to do board borders. The work is precise, tedious, and thankless. Every chessboard needs a tidy edge, just enough embellishment to suggest wealth and taste, but not so much that it distracts from the game. But, as always, someone goes too far. You're sanding the outer rim of a walnut board when you notice it. Thomas has added a flourish, not a simple vine or a standard quatrefoil. No, this is something else. A spiraling ivy motif curling toward each corner in elegant, audacious defiance. At first glance, it's beautiful. At second glance, it's clearly showing off. Giles sees it. Of course he does. His response is swift and silent. He begins his next board with a double-line border, crisp and mathematical, then adds a tiny griffin in the bottom right-hand corner. Just one, tucked in, subtle but deliberate. And so begins the great border escalation of 1273. You wouldn't think border design could cause a multi-week Cold War, but here we are. What starts with vines and griffins quickly spirals into dragons, knotwork, and at one regrettable point a mermaid playing a lute. No one speaks of the mermaid anymore. She was beautiful. She was anatomically implausible. She took 5 hours and gave one apprentice lifelong questions about marine biology. Each new board becomes a passive-aggressive flex. 1 week, Agnes paints a fox curled around the lower border, its tail almost flicking into a rook square. The fox has Giles's eyebrows. A coincidence. Doubtful. Giles responds by carving a sunburst pattern so symmetrical it makes Thomas's ivy look like lazy doodling. Thomas then retaliates with a border of interlocking shields, each bearing a unique, faintly smug expression. You try to keep your head down, but the temptation creeps in. You find yourself etching a single rose at the corner of your current board, just a quiet symbol, nothing bold, nothing confrontational. But when you turn it over to sand the back, someone has already scratched a tiny bee next to it, barely the size of a breadcrumb. The message is clear. Flowers attract insects. You don't know who did it, but you have your suspicions. Historians still argue whether such artistic feuds influenced the evolution of medieval chess sets. Some say the increasing ornateness of European boards during the 13th century stemmed from noble patronage. Others suspect it was just carvers being stubborn, competitive, and kind of petty. You lean toward the second explanation. The patrons, for their part, seem to love it. Every week, someone requests a more imaginative border. One merchant insists on a set with battle scenes around the edge. Make it feel like a real siege, he says. Another asks for roses climbing all four sides, but only the good kind, not those provincial roses. The provincial roses are apparently too sincere. The climax of the border war arrives one rainy Tuesday. Thomas unveils a board so ornate it needs 2 apprentices to carry. The borders feature a full hunting scene. Horses, hounds, a stag leaping across the upper edge, and a falconer in the bottom left corner. The falconer's glove is so detailed you can see the stitching. The falconer's face, unmistakably, Giles. Giles says nothing. He simply turns to his next board and begins carving. You don't recognize the pattern at first, just a series of rippling arcs, smooth and precise. Then it hits you. It's waves. The entire border is a stormy sea, and at the bottom, half sunken in the wood grain, is a small, capsizing boat. The figure in the boat, wearing a falconer's glove. Agnes paints the water, a deep, thunderous gray. The boat, a sad, cracking brown. The eyes of the sinking falconer are blank, but expressive. You can't look at it too long without feeling something between admiration and the need to apologize. It's beautiful and petty and oddly moving. No one says a word. The next day, Thomas stops adding flourishes altogether. Giles returns to straight lines. The war, it seems, has ended in mutual devastation. No winners, just splinters and drowned falconers. You finish your rose and bee board quietly. As you run a cloth over the final surface, you think about how even silence can be loud. That in this workshop, arguments aren't made with words, but with grain, shadow, and the gentle pressure of a knife against wood. That everything unspoken finds a way to surface eventually. The next day, Giles walks past your bench. He doesn't stop, doesn't look, but as he passes, he mutters, "Nice rose." It's the first compliment he's ever given you. You consider etching a second bee. It starts with soup, a rich, oily broth, steaming in a pewter bowl, a bowl that really has no business sitting on a chessboard in the middle of a match. But nobles are nobles, and their appetite for poultry seems to override spatial awareness. You're not in the workshop this time. You're delivering a freshly finished board maple and walnut, simple squares, no dramatic borders to the manner of Sir Aldrich de Brumley, a man who owns 3 falcons, 2 lutes, and precisely 0 sense of strategy. He's hosting a dinner and has decided that nothing pairs better with roast goose than a few rounds of the noble game. The dining hall is warm, smoky, and packed with guests who all look vaguely annoyed at having to focus. Someone in a velvet tunic places the board squarely on a long trestle table between the bread trenchers and a half-carved pheasant. You try not to flinch. The board took 22 hours. One of the bishops has a hand gesture so delicate it makes grown carvers cry. You step back. A servant sets down the soup. Then it happens, an accidental elbow, a slight tip of the bowl, and a slow-motion tragedy unfolds. The broth sloshes across the board, rolling over the queen's crown and pooling into the knight's nostrils. Everyone gasps. The lord's wife curses. A jester somewhere snorts. And you just watch the board buckle. It's subtle at first. The warping. Maple doesn't always hold up well to hot liquid. Within minutes, the dark squares begin to swell ever so slightly. The perfect symmetry now has a hiccup, a gentle rise in the northeast quadrant, like the board has taken a deep breath and doesn't want to let go. No one notices except the players, because suddenly, every pawn placed near that corner teeters just enough to look uncertain. The rook tilts as if doubting its next move. Sir Aldrich, who already plays like a distracted goat, becomes convinced the board is cursed. "I don't recall the game being this unsteady," he mutters. His opponent, a young knight whose chainmail keeps clanking. Every time he leans forward, frowns. "Mayhap it's symbolic," he says. Life is never level. Historians still argue whether this exact dinner, the Brumley soup incident, was the origin of regional chess variants that modified board layouts. Some old manuscripts reference warped corner rules or unstable squares, particularly in East Anglia. A few even describe diagonal drops that alter piece movement. Were these experimental games a joke? Or did a single pot of soup really bend the rules of chess? You know the truth. You saw the board breathe. The manor steward later demands a replacement. The warped board is quietly donated to a nearby priory, where the monks use it for years and come to believe the northwest corner has divine properties. A bishop piece left in that quadrant reportedly foretold a particularly bountiful carrot harvest. Make of that what you will. Back at the workshop, you tell the story, and everyone reacts exactly as expected. Giles sighs and says, "This is why boards should be oiled properly." Thomas nods solemnly. Perhaps the soup was a message. Agnes, she just chuckles and paints a tiny soup stain on the next board's corner, so faint only you would notice. You think about that warped board a lot, about how one small spill created a legacy. It's strangely comforting, like all the effort carving the bishop's thumb just right. Sanding the knight's mane into convincing curls actually mattered. That even failure leaves a dent in history. And yet, part of you wonders whether the real argument that night wasn't about chess at all. Maybe it was about placement. Authority. Who gets to be center stage? And who's stuck in the soup-soaked corner? Because while the nobles squabbled and slurped and tilted rooks like drunken giraffes, the board just sat there. Quiet, warped, permanent. A silent protest, locked in grain. When you return to the workshop, Giles hands you a new blank board. "Don't worry," he says. "No soup this time." You trace the empty squares with your thumb. The wood is clean, flat, full of possibility. You almost miss the tilt. Almost. You're meant to be carving pawns today, simple, unassuming. The least dramatic of the pieces, pawns don't stir drama. They don't wear crowns or carry books. They just march forward and occasionally promote themselves into someone more interesting. At least, that's the theory. But this particular pawn is being difficult. You've carved dozens before. You could shape one with your eyes closed, and once nearly did, until Agnes thwacked you with a paintbrush. But today, your hand stalls just above the nose. Something about the grain is off. It bends where it should be straight. Curves where your sketch insists on symmetry. You try adjusting the angle, but the wood pushes back. You swear the knot in the center looks like a squint. You finish the face anyway? Smooth forehead, rounded cheeks, a faint, pursed lip expression. Then you set the pawn down, stretch your fingers, and glance back. The pawn is smirking. No, really, there's a very slight curl to the lip, and the eyes off-center, just enough to give the impression of sass. You hold it up to the light. It's not malicious, just smug, quietly, smugly judging you. Thomas walks past and snorts. He looks familiar. Giles peers over his glasses, like someone who just married into money and won't stop mentioning it. Agnes doesn't say a word. She just adds the tiniest mole under the pawn's left eye during finishing. A detail so subtle, it borders on private commentary. Now, you could smooth the face. Start over, but that would be admitting something. So you let the pawn be. You call him Rupert, quietly, in your head. And that's how the pawn feud begins. See, pawns weren't always the disposable infantry they are now. In medieval sets, they were often individualized. Some looked like squires, others like farmers or foot soldiers. One famous 12th century Norwegian set featured pawns with round helmets and snarling expressions. Tiny berserkers waiting for a promotion. So, in this workshop, pawns are your chance to add personality. You carve your next pawn slightly taller than Rupert, sleeker jawline, more symmetrical eyes, definitely nobler. You name him Bertrand? Then Giles starts carving his own line of pawns. They're squat, practical, and frown with such gravity They look like they're calculating grain taxes. One even has what appears to be a comb tucked into its belt. Thomas, of course, counters with pawns that look like saints in disguise. Gentle faces, downcast eyes. One has the faint outline of a halo that Agnes insists is just decorative. And so, without ever agreeing on it, the workshop divides. Each carver begins making their own pawn subculture. A full caste system emerges. Giles's pawns are called the stalwarts. Thomas's are the humble-born. Yours. Agnes refers to them as the scandalized gentry. Every day, a new pawn gets placed on the apprentice shelf, an unspoken contest. One has a tiny scroll tucked under its arm. Another wears a faint, carved necklace. One apprentice makes a pawn with both hands behind its back. No one knows why. It makes people nervous. You carve a pawn with its mouth slightly open. A decision you regret when Agnes whispers. He looks like he's about to say, actually. You name that one, Cedric. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a patron requests a custom pawn set, with each figure reflecting the 7 deadly sins. You all volunteer. Giles takes pride. Thomas claims sloth and paints it with patience. You're assigned envy. Naturally, you stare at the block of wood and try to imagine what envy looks like in miniature. You settle on a frown angled slightly toward another pawn's shoulders. Agnes adds a greenish glaze. The result is unsettling. Historians still argue whether pawn individualization was widespread across medieval Europe, or whether it was just a few eccentric workshops like yours. Some surviving sets show clear uniformity. Others are wildly inconsistent. One pawn has a mustache. Another wears a hooded cloak. A third seems to be holding a fish. Scholars debate. Symbolic. Practical joke. Or did someone just really like fish? You're starting to believe it was the latter. One night, while closing the shutters, you find 2 pawns tucked side by side on a forgotten shelf. One from Giles, one of yours. They look at each other with quiet disdain or affection. Hard to say. You leave them there. By week's end, you've carved over 20 pawns, none alike. One leans, one smirks. One is technically missing an ear because someone sneezed mid-cut, and rather than fix it, you leaned into the drama and added a furrowed brow. Your hands ache, your eyes blur, and yet something about it is comforting. These little faces, these tiny dramas, they say what no one in the workshop dares to. You're not just carving game pieces, you're carving a community. And some of them, frankly, need therapy. The candles are burning low and the mead is flowing freely. That's your first warning that this chess match is doomed. You're seated on the sidelines, technically there to observe how nobles use the pieces you've all spent weeks carving. But in reality, you're babysitting 2 grown men who've turned the noble game into a dramatic reenactment of military trauma and social anxiety. Sir Lionel, a baron with a spectacular mustache and even more spectacular temper, is facing off against Sir Guy, a knight better known for his warhorse than his wits. Their match is meant to be the centerpiece of a small gathering wine, bread, gossip, and a display of intellect. So far, the intellect is losing. Sir Lionel frowns down at the board, fingers trembling slightly over his rook. I'll move this one. Diagonally, he declares. You wince. That's not how rooks move. My lord, he glares. I know that. It's a tactical feint. Sir Guy nods solemnly, clearly not understanding but unwilling to admit it. Feint. Excellent. I accept. The game continues like this for another hour. Wrong moves. Half-correct rules. Pieces knocked over by the sleeves of velvet gowns. And all of it happening by flickering candlelight. In a hall so drafty you could swear a rook just shivered. Then, around the 23rd move, which is actually about the 50th if you count all the illegal takebacks, Sir Lionel suddenly slumps forward, chin resting squarely in a pile of warm bread. Silence. Then a snore. A full-bodied, guiltless, deeply unrepentant snore. Sir Guy blinks. Is that checkmate? You check. Technically, yes, though the rules have been mangled so thoroughly that the bishop might as well be playing for the other side, and the queen appears to have vanished into Sir Lionel's mead. You gently nudge the baron. He grunts but doesn't wake. Guy shrugs and raises a cup. To my victory. Then, Historians still argue whether these sorts of muddled, half-sensible matches were common among nobles, or just the byproduct of too much alcohol and too little instruction. A few dusty records describe games that ended in song, sword fights, or fainting spells. One surviving letter from a courtier in 1264 simply reads, "He moved his king onto the bishop's chair and declared himself pope. We let him. You bring the pieces back to the workshop that night. Some are missing. The queen is found the next day under a ham. The knight's nose is chipped, probably from being used as a meat skewer. The rook smells faintly of wax and regret. Agnes raises an eyebrow. Rough game. You set the board down. The baron is still asleep. Thomas peers at the scratched bishop. Looks like he made a point. Though, Giles doesn't say anything. He's too busy adjusting a new design. A rook with wider base legs, less likely to tip during spirited debates. He calls it the Tavern Edition. You think about how this game, in all its chaos, still managed to move something. Not just the pieces, but the people. There was laughter, confusion, a little shouting, a full collapse into bread. And through it all, the board held steady except when someone sneezed directly onto the knight. That's chess, you suppose. Not just war or logic, but performance, theater, played out in miniature. The candlelight only made it more dramatic. Each move was shadowed, each mistake glorified, every snore a punctuation mark. You sit at your bench, pick up a half-finished knight, and start carving. This one will have a slightly tilted head, as if it's listening to a distant snore. The mane will be windswept, heroic. You add a tiny nick on its flank, not from battle, but from drunken celebration, a nod to Sir Lionel's dramatic surrender. Later, you test the new rook Giles carved. It doesn't tip. You knock it gently. It rocks, wobbles, then rights itself. Perfect. You glance at the game still frozen in your mind, the absurdity of it. And yet, the pieces didn't protest. They never do. They endure clumsy hands, foolish decisions, uneven candles, and soup stains. They outlast every player. A knight snores. A rook stands. A game ends. And in the morning, someone resets the board. There's a thud on the work table, a heavy, foreign kind of wood, and just like that, the mood shifts. It's French maple. Polished, imported, expensive, with that strange, slightly sweet scent that makes your local walnut feel like dried barnwood. The grain is tighter, the sheen a little smugger. You run your hand across it and it almost purrs. Giles doesn't like it. You can tell because he doesn't even pretend to examine it. Just grunts and mutters something about continental softness under his breath. Thomas, of course, loves it. He circles the board like it's royalty, maple from Rouen. He whispers reverently, "It glows?" It does. The board is a gift or a threat from Lord Edmund of Norfolk, a patron who recently spent 3 weeks in France and now insists on continental flair in everything. From his goblets to his dog's name, he sends the wood with a short note, a gift for inspiration. Perhaps English carving might rise to the occasion. You all stare at it. That last sentence lands like a slap. Agnes picks up the board, squints at the grain. Feels like an insult. Feels like a dare. You say, so, naturally, everyone wants to carve it. Giles argues that only someone with proper restraint should handle it. Someone who won't over-flourish it like a cathedral tapestry. He says this while glaring at Thomas, who is already sketching a vine motif in the margins of his notebook. Agnes suggests you should carve it. You're the only one who hasn't offended a patron this month, she adds. The vote is quiet. 3 nods in your direction. 1 scowl. You win. The pressure is immediate. French maple isn't like your usual stuff. It resists your tools differently. It doesn't like to be rushed. Every cut feels like a conversation, polite but firm. You try a straight line along the outer edge and the wood pushes back slightly, like it wants you to earn your confidence. You ease into it. No flourishes, no dragons, no hidden foxes or drowning falconers. Just clean, deliberate elegance. The grain becomes your guide shaping curves that feel like logic, restraint, and the occasional deep sigh midway through. Giles walks by, pauses, doesn't speak, just places a cup of cider next to your elbow, a truce in liquid form. Historians still argue whether continental imports disrupted or enhanced English craftsmanship during the 13th century. Some believe the influx of foreign materials led to more ornate and expressive styles. Others argue it sparked guild tension, and a quiet erosion of local tradition. There's even a debated theory that some workshops faked French maple by staining ash and passing it off as exotic. A wood-based forgery, if you will. You believe both are true, because a week after Lord Edmund's French maple board is finished smooth, balanced, subtly gleaming. It's placed in the shop window, and within hours, there's a line of nobles asking for one just like that. A quiet panic ripples through the workshop. You don't have more French maple, you have English oak and a bit of pine that smells like disappointment. Giles drafts a statement. Due to sourcing delays, foreign woods will be reserved for special commissions. Thomas adds a flourish to the parchment and signs it with a quill so flamboyant it practically insults your inkpot. But something deeper changes. The next week, Giles starts polishing his walnut differently. More wax, softer cloth. Thomas carves deeper folds into his bishop's robes. Agnes experiments with gold accents on pawns. You've all seen what's possible, and now, even your old woods feel a little more awake. Of course, there are whispers. One patron demands to know whether his new set is authentically French-flavored. Another wants a blend, as if you're selling cheese and not chessboards. A third complains that his board smells too British. You suggest he try sniffing it again with more imagination. That earns you a coin and a wink. In a quiet moment, you find yourself sanding the back of the French maple board. You hesitate, then carve a single word underneath in small, invisible script, still English. The wood doesn't protest. It gleams. The rook is missing. Again, you arrive early that morning. The kind of early when the streets still smell like dew and regret. And there it isn't, your almost finished rook, gone from your bench like a dream. You forgot mid-blink. You search the usual places. Beneath your stool, behind the pigment jars, inside Agnes's drawer marked, "Definitely not for snacks." There are snacks. Nothing. Not a splinter. You ask around. Giles pretends he doesn't hear you. Thomas suggests unhelpfully that perhaps the rook found religion and left to start a monastery. Agnes just chuckles and says, "Sometimes pieces walk." It's not the first time. This particular rook was a strange one anyway. You carved it from a scrap of cedar, not a common choice, but it had this lovely twist in the grain that you couldn't resist. The shape came out a little sharp. The battlements looked more like teeth. The whole thing leaned, slightly, like it was peering around a corner, or about to leap. You nicknamed it Crooked Neck. It didn't exactly fit with the rest of the set, but that was part of its charm. Like it had a secret. Now it's gone. You grumble your way through the morning, starting a replacement with none of the flair of the original. The new one is fine. Straight, sturdy, utterly boring. It wouldn't run away. It wouldn't dare. At midday, you find Agnes humming as she stirs her soup. You peer into the pot. No rook. She raises an eyebrow and says, "Try the storage loft." You climb the narrow steps, where old boards go to gather dust and bad memories. It's dim, the light filtered through warped window glass. And there, nestled between a crate of cracked bishops and a moldy banner from some forgotten tourney, sits Crooked Neck, staring at you like it knew you'd come looking. No one admits to moving it, but a folded scrap of parchment lies beneath it, faintly smelling of paint and garlic. It reads, "Not everything straight stands strong." Thomas's handwriting. Probably. You bring the rook back to your bench, re-oil it, fix the nick in the base. It still leans. You like that. The other pieces don't seem to mind. Later that afternoon, a customer walks in. A woman with sharp eyes and a traveling cloak that smells faintly of the sea. She picks up Crooked Neck, turns it over in her palm, and smiles. "This one's seen things," she says. You nod. It tends to vanish. She places it back with care. "I'd want that one on my side." She leaves without buying anything. But you don't feel disappointed. Some people just come to see the pieces, like pilgrims at a shrine. The workshop has started drawing more of them lately, travelers. Musicians, clerks on their way to nowhere. They touch the knights, trace the bishops, whisper questions the pieces never answer. Historians still argue whether certain chess pieces were imbued with personality in the medieval imagination, especially rooks. Some records describe them as the Towers of Vengeance, others as silent watchers. One obscure manuscript even calls them caged lions, which may explain why so many old rooks have tiny carved windows, like the piece itself is trapped in a keep. You understand that now. Crooked Neck doesn't look like a castle. It looks like a tower that saw the fire and didn't flinch. That night, you leave the rook on the windowsill. It watches the moon rise, casting thin silver over the grain. You think of the first time you carved it, how you almost smoothed the lean away, how glad you are now that you didn't. Not every piece has to stand straight. Some pieces stand out instead. The queen is too lifelike. That's the complaint, not yours. Of course, you're rather proud of her. Smooth lines, confident posture, a face carved with just enough tilt in the brow to say yes, I know, and no, I won't explain. You'd modeled her loosely off Lady Edith's nose, with a crown inspired by a cathedral spire in Lincoln. But now she's sitting upright in the shop window, and people are unsettled. She's watching me. One baker mutters, half joking. She looks like my aunt. And she was not a good woman, says another. One child insists she moved overnight. You glance at the queen on her tiny throne-carved bone, soft in color, dark at the base from walnut stain, and can't help but agree. There's something in her expression that feels a little too observant, like she knows when someone adjusts the price tags too often, like she sees through dust and silence, like she's waiting. Giles is the first to speak it aloud. She shouldn't be so aware. He wants to remake her. Softer features, more humility. A queen who supports, not one who interrogates. You try not to take it personally, but it's difficult when you're the one who carved her jawline sharp enough to slice fruit. Thomas disagrees. Of course he does. He finds the queen elevating, says she looks like someone who knows God and tells him what to do. Agnes has already nicknamed her watchfulness and started sneaking her into different display positions. Sometimes she sits near the pawns, towering, sometimes right next to the king, facing away, which feels pointed. Once, Agnes perches her behind a bishop, and the bishop looks immediately nervous. Then there's the incense. A merchant from Norwich visits the shop, sees the queen, goes pale, and insists on lighting a stick of lavender incense before he leaves. Says he once saw a statue like that on a pilgrimage and it gave his brother a nosebleed. The next day, someone else does the same. A little ritual is born. Light, bow slightly, step backward. You try to downplay it. She's just well carved. You mumble. But when you come in one morning and find someone's left a half-burned candle and a plum beneath her throne, it's clear the queen has crossed the line from art to omen. Historians still argue whether medieval chess pieces were ever used for more than play if certain pieces became talismans, household protectors, or quiet witnesses to domestic squabbles. One 13th century record references a bone queen placed by a doorway to ward off sour tongues. Another mentions a talking bishop, which was probably just someone's drunk uncle giving bad advice. But this queen feels different. You remember carving her? The care you took with her eyes, not too wide, not too passive. A slight furrow, a sliver of knowing, and the mouth closed, but not resigned. You hadn't meant to give her such presents. You were just focused that day. The light was good, the grain obedient. Your blade didn't slip. Now she's here, looking at everyone. Even Giles softens over time. He starts dusting her pedestal with more care than usual. Once, you see him offer her a quiet nod before beginning a new set. You say nothing. Then she goes missing. Not for long, just an hour. But in that hour, chaos. Giles checks every shelf. Thomas runs down the street, checking with passing vendors. Agnes starts reorganizing the pawn display like it's a crime scene. You just stand there, staring at the empty velvet square where she always sat. Then, as if summoned, she's back, placed carefully on your bench. Not scratched or smudged, just moved. No note, no explanation. Just that same unreadable expression. You never find out who moved her. But after that, no one dares question her again. She becomes a permanent fixture, no longer for sale. Not part of any set. Just her watchfulness. Queen of the workshop. Unchallenged. Undefeated, unblinking. One evening, you're closing up when a small bird lands on the windowsill. It pecks at the glass, looks at the queen, then flutters off. You glance back. She hasn't moved. Of course not. She never does, but somehow, you feel her watching you long after you blow out the last candle. The knight is snarling, not just fierce, not noble, not even stoic in the way some prefer their war horses to be carved. No, this one looks like it just bit someone and isn't sorry. You run your thumb along the curve of the jaw. The teeth are too prominent, the nostrils flared, not in panic, but in indignation. Even the ears are tilted back in suspicion. This horse does not want to be here. This horse has opinions, and you know exactly whose fault that is. Giles had assigned the knight to Thomas after one of his more melodramatic bishop carvings sparked a whispered debate about emotional restraint. The unspoken challenge: carve something simpler, more grounded, more classic. Thomas responded by bottling all his wounded pride into one furious steed. You're the one who walks in early and finds it glinting on the bench, freshly oiled. Eyes narrowed like it just heard someone insult its lineage. And somehow, it's perfect. The knight has always been the wild card of the set. Its movement defies the straight lines of others. It leaps, it bends, it surprises. It's also, historically, one of the trickiest pieces to carve. Not just a horse's head, but a specific kind of horse, not too realistic, not too abstract. You want people to see motion, strength, possibility. But Thomas's knight, it growls. Agnes peers over your shoulder. That one's seen things. You nod. It probably started the fight. The workshop agrees it's technically brilliant, but the mood it introduces shifts something. Patrons who see it react differently. One merchant insists it reminds him of a horse he lost in a fire. A noble woman orders a full set, but requests her knight be less angry and preferably on better terms with the bishop. Still, you can't stop thinking about that expression. The evolution of the knight design has always been uneven. Early Islamic and Indian sets had elephants or chariots in this role. Only later, in Europe, did the horse become standard? And even then, the horse's expression varied wildly. Some cheerful, some proud, some so abstract they looked like ducks with toothaches. Historians still argue why the knight became equine in the first place. Was it chivalric tradition, a nod to mounted nobility, or just a practical shape that fit neatly between bishops and rooks? Some fringe theorists suggest the snarling knights of a few 13th century sets reflect actual war horses trained to bite in battle. An unsettling thought, but one that now makes Thomas's carving feel alarmingly accurate. And you feel the itch to respond. You start sketching a knight of your own, not snarling, not gentle either, just watchful. A creature that doesn't leap into conflict, but sees it coming from 2 moves away. The ears are alert, the mane is short, the eyes are wide. You give it a small scar over one cheek. Nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest it's earned its place. It takes you 3 tries to get the snout right. When you finish, you place it beside Thomas's on the shelf, snarler and watcher. One poised to strike, one calculating how. Agnes walks past, eyes both pieces, and mutters, "Hope they're not on the same team." Giles starts modifying his own knight patterns soon after. His designs become leaner, almost military. No flourish, no softness, just quiet endurance. It's not a trend yet, but you can feel the shift. Suddenly, knights are complicated. You find yourself imagining entire backstories for them. Thomas's knight, definitely raised in a storm. Yours, grew up near the Rook Towers and mistrusts bishops. Giles's knight doesn't speak unless absolutely necessary and has memorized all the pawn names. You know it's silly. You do. But every time your knife meets wood, you find yourself shaping not just movement but mood. Because that's what knights do. They move in unexpected ways. Late one evening, you catch Agnes placing 2 knights opposite each other on an empty board. No other pieces, just a standoff. Who wins? You ask. She shrugs. Depends who blinks first. The knights don't blink. Of course, they just watch and wait. The argument today is over red, not war, not politics, not clergy, just pigment. Specifically, the red ochre that Thomas insists is the only honorable hue for light squares, while Giles maintains it's aggressively optimistic and liable to stain sleeves. You didn't think anyone could get this worked up over a color, but here you are. Watching 2 grown men lean over a pigment pot like it insulted their ancestry. You're stuck between them. Again, literally, your bench is splattered with test swatches, one in a soft burnt sienna, the other a deeper, iron-rich crimson that Giles calls vulgar. Agnes makes things worse deliberately, probably by mixing a new shade that she describes as sunset seen through regret. It's gorgeous. Thomas wants it on all his bishops. Giles says it looks like liver. It all started with a commission from a merchant's wife who wanted a board with brighter contrasts and not the usual black something more poetic, which is how lamp black, the dark standby of centuries, found itself pitted against red ochre, cochineal, soot-tinted walnut, and one regrettable experiment involving beet juice. That board is still drying in the corner. It smells like salad. Back in the day, medieval boards weren't always standard. Some were red and green, others were blue and gold. Historians still argue about how much variation existed and what it meant. Was red symbolic of courage? Was black too funereal? Did pigment availability determine status? Or just show off who had a cousin in the spice trade? You dip a brush into the ochre and test a square, it goes on gritty, earthy, alive. But then you try a swipe of lamp black, sleek, final, cold like riverstone. And you understand, this isn't about aesthetics, it's about tone. Red makes a board feel like a battlefield. Black makes it feel like a reckoning. Thomas accuses Giles of fearing color. Giles accuses Thomas of romanticizing blood. Agnes paints a smiley face on the spare pawn and declares herself neutral. You mix your own blend, a dusky wine red, softened with a hint of ash. You apply it to your testboard in slow, deliberate strokes. It dries into a color that looks like it remembers things, not shouting, not weeping, just knowing. You leave it near the window. The next morning, it's gone. You find it 2 hours later on the main display table. Giles has placed it there without a word. No admission, no praise, just placement, which, in this workshop, is basically a sonnet. That afternoon, a patron comes in young, scholarly, all fingers and questions. He eyes the board. This color, he murmurs. It's not red. Not quite. It's, what is it? You shrug. Depends how you play. He buys the set without asking the price. Later that day, Giles passes your bench. He doesn't stop, but he mutters, not bad, for wine, which is almost affection. Thomas, of course, retaliates by painting an entire set in crimson and naming it the Crusader's Gambit. It sells before it even dries. The pigment debate never ends. It just changes shades. You hear rumors of indigo sets being carved in Spain. Someone mentions green-dyed bone being shipped from Venice. There's even talk of a new black darker than lamp black, made from burned almond shells. You try it once. It smells delicious. Looks like sin. The shop grows louder with color. What once were somber boards of bone and wood are now tinted, glossed, blushed. Each new piece has a mood that begins before the first move. You carve a queen with a pale rose base and dark wine crown. She looks like she's about to deliver bad news very politely. You call her Dawn. Before the letter, Agnes approves. You start to realize the game begins before the game. The moment someone sees the board, the pieces, the pigment, they're already deciding who they are. Cautious, bold, melancholy, reckless. Color speaks first. That night, you dream of squares shifting from red to black and back again, like a tide. And when you wake, you can still smell the ochre. It was supposed to reach the Pope. That was the idea. Anyway. A grand commission, the finest board your workshop had ever carved, sent across the continent as a gift to Rome. Or maybe a bribe, or maybe just a statement. Look what we can do. With only sawdust in our lungs and a few questionable chisels. The board was flawless. Not just beautiful, flawless. Giles had selected the sycamore himself, running his hands along the raw planks like a sommelier sniffing corks. Thomas hand-carved each bishop with extra folds in their robes and faint halos behind their heads. You spent a full day polishing the knight's teeth to a shine that made Agnes wince. The pigment was Agnes's finest work. Yet deep red squares so velvety they looked like dried velvet petals, and dark ones stained with black walnut oil that shimmered slightly in candlelight. It even smelled expensive. The day it left the shop, you all stood in silence as the merchant packed it in wool and straw, slipped it into a sturdy oak crate, and nailed the lid shut with the care of a man sealing away a saint. Then it vanished, somewhere between Norwich and Bruges. The crate was misplaced or stolen or quietly rerouted into the hands of someone who had no intention of ever seeing Rome. The merchant returned with a shrug and a very long invoice for transport risk. No one was reimbursed. No one confessed. The board was gone, and no one was surprised. You see, this wasn't the first. A long list of special boards had already developed reputations for going astray. There was the one that was supposedly swallowed by a river barge near Calais, another rumored to have been gifted to a Polish noble by accident. One even turned up at a Parisian brothel, being used as a makeshift serving tray. The queen piece was missing. Interpret as you wish. Historians still argue whether such losses were acts of theft, fate, or deliberate misdirection. Some believe that high-end chess sets were a form of silent currency easily smuggled, traded, hidden in plain sight. Others argue the boards simply suffered the same fate as most fine things in the 13th century, forgotten in mud, snapped during travel, or turned into firewood by someone who preferred checkers. In the shop, no one talks about the Rome board, not directly, but you can feel its absence. Giles starts working on a new design the very next day, quieter, less fussy. He says it's for a merchant in Ipswich, but the lines are too clean, too mournful. You suspect it's not for sale at all. Thomas, surprisingly, doesn't dramatize. He just begins a new set, carving each piece with slightly more solemnity. His bishops frown now. Agnes stops using red for a week. And you can't stop wondering where the board ended up. You imagine it sitting in some dusty corner of a portside tavern, being used to settle bets over dried fish and dice, or perched on a mantle in a Bruges townhouse, admired by someone who doesn't know who made it, but recognizes its weight. Maybe it reached Rome after all. Maybe it sits in a darkened antechamber, untouched, guarded by a dozing priest who only wakes when the dust gets too thick. One evening, you find an unfamiliar visitor in the shop, an older man, foreign, traveling alone. He asks no questions, just lingers near the boards. His fingers trace a knight's ear. He nods slowly. Before leaving, he turns to you and says, in slow, accented Latin, "I saw a board like this once, in Lyon. It was missing a rook." You nod. Say nothing. He leaves a coin on the bench larger than usual and disappears into the fog. That night, you start carving a new set. Not for sale. Not for display. You use ash and walnut, and you leave the rook pieces until last. And when you carve them, you make them slightly different. One leans, just a little, just enough to remember something. It starts with a creak in the wall, not loud, not ominous, just the kind of faint wooden sigh that old workshops make when winter begins to poke at the shutters and the boards remember every nail ever hammered into them. You're on your knees, digging behind a storage bench for a misplaced tin of bristle brushes, when your palm lands on something wrong. Not a brush, not wood, not splinter or dust. Something smooth, cool, curved. You freeze. Your fingers wrap around it instinctively, pulling it into the light. It's a chess piece. A bishop. Old. Very old. Too old. You sit back, legs going numb, heart doing that stupid thing where it hurries even though all you're holding is a sliver of carved bone. But the details. Oh, they don't lie. The miter is flatter than Thomas's usual work. The eyes are narrower. There's a tiny etching along the crozier almost worn away, but not quite. A half symbol, like a sun with 3 rays. You know that mark? Giles's teacher used it. The man who ran the shop before this one, and the one before that. You've seen one other piece like this, once, in the town museum. It was found in a collapsed cellar under the old guild hall. Nobody knew where it came from, until now. You turn the bishop in your hand, tracing the base. There, just under the ring, carved in the same hand, buried for peace. You don't move. You don't even breathe. Because someone hid this. Not by accident. This wasn't dropped. It was tucked carefully, reverently into a hollow pocket behind the wall. And for what? To protect it. To punish it. To end a feud that didn't need words. You show Giles. His face folds into silence. He takes the bishop from your hand, sets it on the table gently, like it might break from memory alone. We stopped carving them like this after the argument, he says. The argument. Capital A. You've heard whispers, a feud that ended a partnership. dissolved apprenticeships, split families into rival guilds that wouldn't share pigment or bench space for years. Agnes joins, eyes wide. She doesn't touch the piece, just peers close. So this is the one. Thomas, unusually quiet, says, "It's beautiful." It is, smaller than today's bishops, softer, less commanding. It leans ever so slightly, not in weakness, but in weariness, like a figure who's delivered too many messages, mediated too many conflicts, and now simply wants to rest. You all agree without agreeing to say nothing to the patrons. This bishop is yours. The shop's history tucked in a wall, now blinking awake. Later that night, when the candles burn low and only you remain, you find yourself sitting with the piece again. You set it alone on a blank board. No pawns, no knights, no king or queen, just the bishop, diagonally placed, as if mid-journey. Historians still argue whether pieces like this were ever meant to be played again. One theory suggests they were retired after especially contentious games set aside to cool tempers, or to honor some private conflict. Another theory says pieces like this were messengers, carved with intent, gifted with meaning, never moved beyond one board. You believe something else entirely. You think this bishop was buried to end an argument that couldn't be solved with rules or turns. A piece sacrificed not in play, but in hope. A carved apology. You wrap it in cloth and place it in a small wooden box. Not hidden, but not displayed. Safe. And in your next bishop design, you echo the old form. Narrower eyes, flatter crown, a hint of lean, not a copy, just a remembrance. A peace offering in pine. The board is unfinished. It lies on your bench, edges still rough, squares unpainted. But if you flip it over just gently, like turning a page of something sacred, you see the underside has already been marked. Not with a signature, not with a maker's mark, but with a message, etched faintly into the wood, so light it might vanish in the wrong light. Your bishop still couldn't hold a line. No name, no flourish, just that sentence. And suddenly, everything clicks. You remember the feud, the real one? Not the playful snipes about pigment or horse ears, not the flirtation with French maple or the passive-aggressive borders. The real fight, between two carvers whose rivalry got so sharp it splintered the shop. The ones who each claimed to have designed the perfect bishop form, who stopped speaking, who, some say, never reconciled. This is their board. You run your hand across it. You can still feel the tension in the grain tight, coiled, like the wood itself remembers every grudge carved into it. One side has subtle curves in the frame, the other, rigid corners. Two aesthetics, battling not across a game, but across the object itself. One piece of wood, two worlds, no resolution. You find Giles near the back of the shop, sorting old wax blocks. You hold out the board. He takes one look, one breath, and then slowly sits down. "Ah," he says, "that one." He tells you the story, softly, while the light fades. About Ewan and Martin, two master carvers, both brilliant, both stubborn, how they spent months working on this single board, each refusing to yield, how they tried to compromise, but every attempt just made it worse. The angles clashed. The details contradicted. The rooks didn't match. One of them carved a knight so dramatic the other one added a bishop with a smirk. And that was that. And then, at the end, Ewan carved that sentence under the board. Not out of spite, out of grief. His last move in an argument that had no winner. They never worked together again. The board was never sold. Giles has kept it all these years. Moved it from shelf to shelf, bench to bench. Couldn't bring himself to finish it. Couldn't bring himself to toss it either. You ask him why. He shrugs. It's part of the shop now. And he's right. Because this place is full of arguments, soft ones, old ones, unspoken ones. They're tucked into rook windows, bishop collars, pawn mouths, silent debates carved into quiet wood. You spend the rest of the evening sanding the edges, not to erase, just to soften. You don't finish the board. You leave it open-ended. A maybe, a might, a next. That night, the workshop is still. The windows reflect the amber glow of the last candle. You look around at the shelves at pawns with smirks, queens with secrets, rooks with crooked necks. All the little arguments, still standing, still waiting, still ready. You dim the lamp, and for just a moment, you imagine a game not yet played, a move not yet made, a silence that finally, gently, let's go. The workshop quiets now. The tools have been set down. The dust has settled into corners, and the candles have all burned low. Even the figures, those queens, knights, and bishops with their carved little quarrels, seem to rest easier in the hush that follows a long, quiet day. You exhale slowly. The air smells like wood smoke and old varnish. Outside, the wind taps lightly at the shutters, as if it, too, is ready to be done with its own busy evening. In the dimness, your hands are still warm from the carving bench, but the tension has faded from your shoulders. The last board, unfinished, imperfect, sits tucked in the corner, waiting for no one in particular. You walk past each shelf, checking on the sets like you would old friends. The watchful queen, the snarling knight, the rook that leaned, they've all earned their sleep. The shop creaks again, not a warning, just a sigh, and so you let your breath slow, matching the rhythm of the place. Your eyes grow heavier, your thoughts soften. You start to imagine the pieces moving not on a board, but in dreams. Pawns stepping carefully through fields of felt, bishops gliding diagonally across soft moonlight, queens resting their crowns on silken cushions. The night stretches long and gentle, and the silence, that old, stubborn silence, finally feels kind.